Hi Lorraine, how are you today?
Hi Jürgen, I'm good. How are you?
I am also well. This is the second of our MurdochLawCasts, and this time what we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and in particular about what it might mean legally that the United States a couple of weeks ago decided to, not surprisingly, withdraw from that Paris Climate Change Agreement.
Exactly, and it's something that Donald Trump in particular made a lot out of during the election campaign, so it's not really surprising, and yet it's something that's been enormously controversial ever since he announced it a few weeks ago.
Indeed, and without getting into the conclusions, in preparation for this little podcast, we saw this morning that the famous, some say notorious Danish climate change expert, Lomborg, what is it, Brian Lomborg? Björn Lomborg wrote a piece in The Australian in which he criticizes, in essence, the Paris Agreement on its ability to actually impact what needs to happen and what he doesn't deny needs to happen. And if we take this up front, we'll get back to it at the end. Maybe the most striking result of the American withdrawal from Paris is that it did not happen with anything in mind to replace it. So it's not geared to have a better policy, at least for all we know. It is a withdrawal on the basis of having no policy, or on the basis of perhaps even denying that there is a problem.
And it's one of the interesting things about the column today, but also more generally the responses to Trump's withdrawal. There are those who say that it is a global catastrophe, that it will result in the world being unable to move forward on the issue of climate change, because the Paris Agreement was a symbol of absolute triumph when it was signed, that the world was finally able to agree on a framework. There are others who say, well, the Paris Agreement doesn't really contain any hard obligations. It's an agreement that purely has aspirational terms, soft obligations, so it really doesn't matter if a country like the United States withdraws. And that's probably a good place to start, to think about what actually is the Paris Agreement and what does it actually do.
Indeed, and we'll talk more about that. I'm not even sure at this point whether both of these contentions could not be right at the same time, but we'll see. You're quite right. Let's just go have a brief look at how this Paris Agreement works, what it was supposed to be, and one of the interesting things that I found in reading up to this was the level of discussion, at least from an international law perspective, of what the Paris Agreement legally actually is.
And I think the Paris Agreement contains a real mixture from a legal perspective of what we'd call hard obligations, so things that countries have signed up to having to do, and what we call soft obligations, which is really the political side of the Paris Agreement, where it has more aspirational ideas that are contained within it about things that countries might like to do, but they're really not legally obliged.
And I would say not surprising at all. And there are reasons, obviously, for why it is the way it is. And to sum it up, the reason is a political reason. If you have 180 plus countries involved in the process, you're not going to get the perfect outcome. If you're going to have an outcome, it's not going to be a perfect outcome. It's not going to be a perfect outcome from the perspective of those who want as little as possible, and it's not going to be a perfect outcome from the perspective of those who want as much as possible. It's going to be somewhere in between. From a legal perspective, however, I would say the question of whether this is an international treaty, for example, does not rely in any way on the fact of whether all of these provisions in there are hard law or whether some of them are soft law.
Oh, absolutely, and you see in every international agreement that's signed up to, it contains a variety of obligations, some of which are mandatory, compulsory obligations that at an international level a country, when they sign the agreement, are saying we will do this. And there are always other obligations that are softer, that are more open to interpretation, that are aspirational, or that may in themselves have multiple different ways that a country can agree to comply with its obligations.
How is it here? I think we can give some examples as to what is on the harder law side, where countries have undertaken obligations that can subsequently be checked as to whether they have been breached or kept. Right? And I think we don't want to delve into the various provisions too much detail, but I think we can say that all of the clauses in the Paris Agreement that deal with actual emission targets to be set and to be developed down the line are soft law targets.
Yes.
That's a fair assessment.
Absolutely.
So whether a certain target will actually have been reached by one of the states parties to this agreement or not will down the line in and by itself not allow anybody to qualify that country as having breached the Paris Agreement or not having breached the Paris Agreement.
And yet even there's a mixture of hard and soft law, because the targets themselves the countries get to set, and as you said, there's a soft law obligation, but the fact that they have to set a target, and this idea that each target they set has to be progressively moving forward and becoming larger, well, that's setting mandatory
Indeed.
language.
And hence the second point I was going to make was that the hard law targets are largely around procedure, largely around reporting and transparency of what the countries are doing and how they are developing their national commitments.
Exactly. And part of the reason for this is entirely political, as you mentioned, because you need to understand the background to the Paris Agreement to understand the agreement itself. And indeed, it stems right back to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You can see the Kyoto Protocol emerging from that, which did try to set targets that were harder law targets in that sense, and resulted in the majority of countries breaching their obligations under the protocol. So when you come to the Paris Agreement, the world was quite concerned about setting targets in a way that was achievable and that would get a consensus in terms of a majority of countries actually coming on board.
Which of course is necessary, and I guess already at this level we can see why the reaction to the Americans withdrawing can cause two different reactions. If of course one comes from, if you will, the technocratic analysis of what is hard and what is soft, and then one reaches, especially from a maximist position, the conclusion not overly much is hard, and then the conclusion is plausible to say, well, you know, if the Americans get out, it's not going to really change all too much on the ground. On the other hand, having for the first time, if you will, the world community agreeing, A, that there is a grave problem, B, that something has to be done, C, agreeing on a framework of what needs to be done that tries to balance previous contributions to the problem, which of course lie mostly with the Western states, current developments and contributions to the problem, which of course lie still with the Western states, but increasingly and very much increasingly with the new big players like China, India perhaps not yet, but it's clearly immediately on the horizon. Other Asian states that perhaps weren't as prevalent even in the 1990s when that process largely started. South American states, Brazil, also much more prevalent today. And to balance what needs to be done, in other words, to balance the obligations on the one hand, then to look at the mitigation problem, and then actually arrive at a framework by which the rich countries take on obligations to feed money into mitigation projects in the smaller developed and least developed countries who are unable to actually cope with that, arguably. I mean, that is a huge thing, right? It's a big thing.
It's a really difficult thing to do, and the temptation, I suppose from the American perspective, when you look at why Obama entered into this agreement, the temptation was to achieve an agreement on the international stage, and that was seen as being so difficult and so all-important that really the president at that point launched in and did whatever he could to get the agreement. But in doing so, he forgot about the need to actually have a democratic base of support back home. And by democratic, I don't mean democratic versus Republican. I mean having the will of the people behind him. And this is such a difficult, complicated balancing of interests that you really do need that groundswell community support with you before you sign an international agreement like this. Otherwise, the risk is the next president comes along and says, well, actually, community sentiment is with me. We don't like the balance you've struck, and so we withdraw. So in fact, this is a problem that Trump is getting a lot of criticism for, but really the origins of the difficulty lie in Obama striking an agreement that he never sought congressional approval for, and in fact didn't have that basis of support at home that was needed to see the agreement carry through regardless of any changes in the presidency.
Let's hold off on that for just a second, because that would that allows us to take a look at how do you actually legally get out of the Paris Agreement, and
that's fairly trite law to say at the beginning that withdrawal from an international agreement, the first thing you do is look at the agreement itself and see what it says about withdrawal.
And it has a termination clause in it, and the Paris Agreement is Article 28, and it in essence says that after 3 years after the agreement enters into force is the earliest
in the particular country.
For this particular country, in this case, the United States, the first withdrawal opportunity is 3 years after that, and then you have to give notice, and the notice period is 1 year. In essence, that means for any country that signed up to Paris and then subsequently ratified Paris at home, the minute it becomes effective for them, 4 years after that date is the first get-out date. Coincidentally enough, this get-out date will coincide with the Trump presidency, so the getting out of the agreement, if it happens to the letter of the treaty, so if the Americans keep the obligations of the treaty, will happen when the first term of Donald Trump is about to end or will just have ended.
Exactly. So potentially we find the first termination date or withdrawal date for America, withdrawal becomes effective in 2020, and this will then be an issue that is fought over, you can envisage, during that presidential election, because it's right at the time that withdrawal will be becoming effective.
So we can, there is another way to get out of the Paris Agreement, that is if one were willing to go a couple of steps further and remove one's country out of the climate change framework, the United Nations climate change framework, altogether.
Which is the underlying convention. And that has Article 25, which effectively replicates the withdrawal provision in the Paris Agreement and says that after 3 years of the United Nations Framework Convention becoming effective in a country can indicate its intention to withdraw, and then the withdrawal becomes effective 1 year after that. But of course, because the UN Framework Convention became active in America before the Paris Agreement, the withdrawal date for that now in America would be 12 months from whenever they
Exactly, and that is taken into account in the Paris Agreement itself, which in subsection 3 of Article 28 refers to the termination of the Framework Convention, and merely states that terminating the Framework Convention will also automatically terminate the Paris Convention.
So in essence,
Paris Agreement.
The American president has to wait almost over 3 years, closer to 4 years, to be able to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but conceivably could withdraw from the entire show in 12 months' time.
In 12 months' time, which is not necessarily plausible.
Well, and there is one added difficulty, of course, that if they want to withdraw from the underlying framework, it seems that the US president couldn't do that on his own. He'd actually need to go and seek congressional approval.
And that brings us back to what you started before, because what you started before when you spoke about Obama having gotten into the Paris Agreement without sufficient democratic support, and when you now mention that getting out of the framework might require more than just the president acting, you're making reference to a specific constitutional legal situation in the United
Yes.
States, namely that foreign agreements in their conclusion and therefore also in their termination require the advice and consent of the United States Senate. That is quite different from the Australian situation, where formally the Parliament has no role in the treaty conclusion and only come into the picture if there is treaty implementation is necessary. In other words, if something needs to change in the domestic law, then of course Parliament has to do it, but the conclusion of the treaty is an executive matter alone in the United States, not so in Australia, not so in the United States, where the Senate is involved in this. So against that background, maybe if you could just explain to me one more time the Obama difficulty and the Trump consequence out of that difficulty.
Absolutely. So the starting point is the United Nations framework. The United States executive government did seek congressional approval for that. So that was approved by the Senate, and therefore to withdraw from that convention, you'd need to go back to the Senate. The Paris Agreement is slightly different. Obama knew there were going to be difficulties getting the Senate to approve the Paris Agreement. And so it was classified not as a treaty but as an executive agreement, which is quite unusual when you look at the terms of the Paris Agreement. And the way it's been dealt with right around the world has been very much in that traditional treaty sense.
Of course, we have to just inject that executive agreements are a known category in the United States constitutional law. It is also accepted law that executive agreements do not require advice and consent by the Senate.
Absolutely.
And we also know that the content of the Paris Agreement as it stands is in no small degree, was in no small degree determined by the American delegation very carefully weighing what they could put in the agreement that would allow them to avoid advice and consent by the Senate, in other words, qualification as a treaty in the American constitutional sense, not in the international law sense, in the American constitutional sense, versus what could still pass as an executive agreement, allowing them to avoid advice and consent by the Senate.
And certainly that may have been a very clever political ploy at the time, because it allowed Obama to put his signature to this agreement, to bind the United States, and not to have to face up to those domestic political headaches around whether he could or could not get approval for it. The ramification of that is that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. So if the United States enters into an executive agreement at the whim of the president, it can be withdrawn from an executive agreement at the whim of the president. And that's
in line with the language of the agreement, in this case, in the Article 28.
Indeed.
I think there's that then, of course, even makes constitutional sense. If you get in one way, you can get out the same way. And obviously, as getting in with advice and consent by the Senate would have made life more difficult, getting out with 67 votes in the Senate would have been more difficult than just an executive decision by the president. That brings us back to the question at the beginning. Good thing, bad thing, neither here nor there?
Interesting thing.
Certainly an interesting thing, yes.
At the end of the day, the Paris Agreement in and of itself isn't something that's going to solve the problem. For all of the cheering that you saw at the United Nations when the agreement was finalised, it isn't an agreement in and of itself that's going to save humanity. So I think a lot of the rhetoric in this is very overblown in terms of what the agreement itself is going to achieve or is going to be able to achieve. I think the biggest lesson from this in terms of American politics is the importance of making sure you have that grassroots support, that broad-based political support, and that there's not a democratic deficit between your international agreements and what you can actually deliver at home. But the biggest takeout, I think, from this, and coming back to the column this morning, is Trump has withdrawn. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, the real problem is he's withdrawn without having an alternative position. And that's a difficulty, because whether you believe in the Paris Agreement or not, the fact that we now don't know what the United States is going to do at an international level is problematic, given their leadership position in terms of climate change and where they sit in terms of the emissions that their country is responsible for.
Yeah, I agree on the limited notion of the impact on climate change policy and effects immediately now is probably going to be rather minute. So the technocratic side, if you will, rather minute. I think it is a big setback for those who believe that we need some form of transnational, international cooperation and collaboration, especially because the withdrawal of the United States happened for domestic reasons, for if you will, selfish reasons alone. It was not, in that sense, a disagreement with we have a better policy and that will actually have more impact. In which case, that would have made life easier. As you say, there's no alternative. It just has nothing to do with climate change other than denying that it is a problem, if anything. Now, hope dies last. I think the reaction so far, and we'll have to see, future will tell, could also show that the rest of the world is pulling more together. And that the price tag, the political price tag for somebody to want to stand outside could be greater than one thinks at the moment. Of course, that's a hope. If everybody resorts to their own selfish reasons, then we will have, governance deficits. Things just will not happen.
And that could go one of two ways, couldn't it? Because on the one hand, the response of the other world leaders being so united in condemning the withdrawal by Trump could have the effect of strengthening the agreement in terms of the remaining participants.
Indeed, that's what I meant, yeah.
The flip side of that is the rhetoric about we will not renegotiate, you can't change your mind on this, could be particularly unhelpful if it does result in other world leaders starting to feel as though perhaps they can question what in their national interest might be a bad deal. And Trump's been very effective in putting the argument that this is a bad deal for the United States and that he's going to assess all of these agreements on the basis of putting the national interest first. That's a big shift in rhetoric from what Obama was saying only a few years ago, and may mean, again, that other world leaders need to readjust their view and think about whether, in the overall context, you do need to go back and sit down with him and work out where does the United States sit on these issues, rather than just yelling at him and telling him he's wrong.
True. The system is set up that a country can do that. The A country can withdraw or not even join in the first place. That was possible here. There needs to be political conviction to do that. But the rest of the community also will have to weigh whether a Trumpian deal, whatever Trump would regard to be in the best interest of the United States, is a worse deal than a deal that the rest of the world has without the United States. Well, and part of that deal, and this is the interesting side of this question, because it links international law and domestic and constitutional law so nicely, will of course depend on what the reaction is in the United States.
And that's, I was about to say, part of the really interesting thing here is the states in the United States who've already come out and said, well, we're still going to go along with the Paris Agreement and voluntarily try and comply with the obligations America had previously undertaken. So you've had a number of states already form a separate grouping to say they will already continue that commitment. So,
and that can be actually enforced by such a behavior. So I really think it's not implausible that the overall effect and outcome of Trump's decision to withdraw might actually be better climate outcomes, because everybody, gangs together, the states see their role, they can much better portray their role because they have somebody sitting there who, is, if you will, the enemy. California will play a more prominent role, many cities will play a more prominent role. The Pittsburgh mayor came out straight away and says he wasn't representing the interests of Pittsburgh because he had made reference to Pittsburgh in the withdrawal. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of these things pan out politically. And I think we must never forget that all law, always, especially constitutional law and these higher level international law things, are closely linked with politics.
And that's one of the big lessons, I think, to come out of this, that the prism through which people have been reacting to Trump's decision to withdraw have largely depended upon their views of climate change, not their views about the legalities of withdrawal or otherwise, because at the end of the day, everything Trump is doing is withdrawing, Obama did in entering.
Yeah.
Two
So
sides
I
of
think
the
there
same
can be
coin.
we are, the behavior of the United States, as we know it, as of today, with regard to the Paris Agreement, is perfectly legal. There's nothing wrong with legally, nothing wrong with
Absolutely.
withdrawing from that agreement. Constitutionally, there was, I think, nothing wrong with getting into the agreement as an executive agreement, but the political cost is you can get out of it as an executive agreement, clearly.
I'm not sure I agree with that entirely at the beginning. I think it was really stretching the definition of executive agreement, but that's a question for another day.
But that's a question for another day. If somebody were to take that to the Supreme Court, who is the only arbiter in that, that would be indeed interesting. We probably are going to get some decisions around other executive decisions made by Obama, and of course, as we can see, Trump is using that instrument widely as well.
And again, without going off topic, it's one of the really interesting issues legally in America at the moment, that expansion of executive power that for some people was fantastic when it was Obama doing it, but now that Trump has those powers and is using them as well, is becoming more problematic. So again, these issues of law need to be looked at as issues of law, not through the prism of what outcome you happen to like politically or not.
Indeed, that is very important, and that's something we want to stress.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.